Good afternoon and welcome to the See You Try show. I am super happy. It is both Sexual Assault Awareness Month and Child Abuse Prevention Month. And I am super happy to have Jaya with RACES and Elizabeth with the Children's Advocacy Center here to talk about both their organizations, their work, some upcoming events, and ways that you can maybe be involved in some advocacy and other initiatives. But without further ado, I want to always remind people that the views and the opinions of our guests are their own. So, but this work is provided for and supported by the Champaign County Mental Health Board and other local funders that allow us to sort of spend time talking about the needs of individuals as we try to make Champaign County a trauma and justice informed community. So without further ado, I'm going to let you introduce yourselves and, just in case people don't really know who you are, tell people like who you are and what your organization is all about. So thank you. Jaya, can I get you to go first? And Elizabeth, I'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Just because she's first on my screen.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be on with you. So my name is Jaya Colasetti. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm the executive director at Rape Advocacy Counseling and Education Services, or RACES. We're the community-based sexual violence and stalking service provider for all of Champaign County, as well as for Douglas and Piatt counties. And we offer a range of services, both related to prevention and response. So this is certainly an appropriate month to be talking about what resources are available to our community. So just a very quick rundown of what those are. First, I want to make sure that people know what our hotline number is, because even just talking about the services can bring things up for people. So that number is 217-384-4444. And that's available 24 hours a day for anyone who's been impacted by sexual violence or stalking and wants someone confidential to talk to. So whether someone's a survivor or supporter, just has questions, that's available anytime. Our other response services to folks who've already experienced sexual violence or stalking include in-person crisis intervention services. So sometimes you'll see us at events to provide support. We do have some walk-in hours too. And then we have more kind of ongoing services. So if someone is looking to start therapy, we offer free therapy services. And then we have our advocacy program. So our legal advocates help with things like protective orders, court accompaniment, making sure that people know what their rights are with various programs and assistance opportunities. And then we also have our medical advocates who respond to the emergency department 24 hours a day to provide support again, make sure that people know what their rights are, provide some referrals, and bring out clothing if it's needed. So that's some of the work that we do once someone has already experienced harm, but we are also working to try to change things so that we're not so needed in the future. So we have a prevention education program that starts with young folks, with kindergartners, and then moves all the way up through 12th grade and professional training as well, where we're talking about things like healthy relationships and boundaries and trusted adults. So, again, we're thinking about how do we create a more social justice oriented, safer community for everybody.
Yeah. And it's such a full range of services and supports, and individuals could be like, oh my gosh, I can't figure out what I need and how to navigate it. And so I want to encourage folks that you can call that hotline, even if it's just like, I don't know what I need or where to start or where to begin in this journey, or I don't know what's available to me or if this would even be relevant. And so to see that as a whole continuum, but you don't have to figure it out. What I love about RACES and its history, and we'll go a little bit deeper, is that folks will really walk alongside you and help you kind of sort through the journey. I also heard something new. I didn't know about the stalking fees. So again, we're going to come back to that in just a second. All right, Elizabeth, introduce yourself. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Hi. Thanks again, Karen, for having us on. My name's Elizabeth. I'm the family advocate here at the Champaign County Children's Advocacy Center. So we serve both Ford and Champaign counties. And we provide a range of services as well. Probably most notable is that we provide forensic interviews to children from age 3 to 18. And we coordinate a multidisciplinary response to that. So we work closely with law enforcement, therapists, DCFS, state's attorneys, and some other agencies in the area to make sure that we are all working together for the absolute best outcome for the children and families that we serve. And we also provide counseling to children and their non-offending caregivers. It's immediate trauma-based counseling that we can get these kids into. So when we're able to do that, it's just absolutely amazing and crucial for them. And we provide some advocacy and case management services. That's what I handle a lot. So I follow up with families, and throughout the whole process of criminal justice and investigation, if the case is going that way, it can be a really long process. So part of what we do is just making sure that there's at least one person with eyes on the case, watching everything and looking out for the victim's needs. So that's what we do.
I love it. So Elizabeth, I'm not going to pick on you, but I'm going to say, like, I think the CAC process is probably the most invisible to most people in the community, and probably the one that, like, people have tons of curiosities but maybe don't know. So I'm going to ask that, like, we break it down. So right, I'm going to ask you to, like, explain, like, all of those various pieces, because I think that sometimes our lack of understanding of what the pieces are leads to, like, disconnect and, you know, confusion. And so who are you serving, right? Let's let's be there, and then explain, like, how would somebody get connected to you, and then what would be a forensic interview? Because again, I see a CSI, and are you know, looking for DNA and, you know, cell samples? And I know that that's not the case, but it might be nice to explain that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So the people that we see are referred to us either through DCFS or law enforcement. So when a report of an allegation of child abuse is made, DCFS and law enforcement will coordinate, and they will call us to set up the forensic interview. So what a forensic interview is it's basically a way to question a child in a way that's not traumatizing for them, that's forensically sound, so that we're not leading the child to certain answers, or it's not an interrogation. And we have 2 certified forensic interviewers on staff who do that. Combined, they have over 15 years of experience doing this. So they handle the forensic interview portion, and that's recorded, and also law enforcement and DCFS will observe the interview at that time, so that they can ask if they have any questions they need follow-up on or anything like that. And then the cases that we serve are specifically child sexual abuse and serious physical abuse. We do sometimes have other cases that come in, like labor trafficking, human trafficking, those sort of cases that we also help with. But for the most part, it is sexual and physical abuse victims in our community. So yeah, does that answer?
No, that's perfect. I think sometimes it's just so confusing. And so, you know, what you probably want to stress, and I know Races has this as a philosophy, is that there were, like, systems that were designed to be really, really client-centered and to make sure that they reduce the burden and the harm. And so when there's been an allegation of sexual abuse or really bad physical abuse for children, there's been structures that have been in place that have been found to be so essential in helping children and families navigate through what is a very difficult process. It's not like this aggressive criminal process. It's a very sensitive process. And so I think that, it's important to really, again, if I'm at home and I really don't know, and I might have heard about it and I see things on TV, I may not understand just how intimate it is. And right. And then I want to say, Jaya, your system is actually really client-centered, but completely in some ways disconnected. So we probably want to talk about how your system is slightly different, but with the same sort of client-centered, strength-based, culturally responsive approach.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it is so important. There is, of course, a lot of overlap, right? Because they're seeing children who've been sexually abused, and we also do serve children who've been sexually abused. We see them in the emergency department. We do provide that therapy service for them and their non-offending significant others as well. And I want to take a moment to kind of talk about why non-offending, right? Because it's not that people who cause harm don't deserve support and opportunities to change as well, because they certainly do. But in creating spaces that are survivor-centered, that are focused on creating as safe a space as possible, we want to think about what's going to feel right. If someone walks into our space, we don't want them to have to worry about seeing the person who harmed them as they're coming in for services. So we provide referrals for those folks who may have enacted harm so that they can get the help that they need. And we can really focus on the needs of the survivors that we're working with.
Yeah.
So it looks different for everybody, right? Not everyone's going to want to engage in the criminal justice system. That's not what justice looks like for some people, right? And so while there is kind of a more set process for the Children's Advocacy Center, where they've got those reports coming in from other entities, and then there's a way that it moves forward in a very trauma-informed way, right? Ours is a little bit different, right? If people want to engage in that system, we absolutely will walk alongside them, right? We'll be there for as much of that time as they want us there for, or as little, right? If they're like, no, I got this, no, thank you. We're not going to be pushing our services on folks. But again, that's not what justice looks like for everybody. That's not what healing looks like for everybody. And so we're really here to say, what do you need from us, right? How can we support you as you start thinking about healing, as you decide what feels right for you right now? And that's going to change, right? We see folks who come in, shortly after something has happened. We see people who it's been, weeks, months, years, decades since something has happened. And it really has to be on that individual's time, right? What feels right to them in that moment, and not that they're being pushed into something that doesn't feel appropriate or right for them, or that it's not the right time. And I do think that time piece is really important, because being able to promptly respond is essential, but not pushing people into something when they're not ready is really important in terms of that trauma-informed perspective as well, because we don't want to enact further harm by asking people to engage in a process that they're not ready for.
Yeah. And so lots of trauma sensitivity throughout. I wouldn't always say trauma informed, but we're getting there. We're definitely trauma sensitive. So I think we have talked a little bit about the services and what they look like. I want to come back and talk about some of the counseling and family support services, because I think, again, if I want to be on the weeds, I really want to be able to visualize it, because I think that helps people navigate. But can we step back like a little bit, because it's like an awareness month? Why is there these awareness months? Why are we kind of thinking about Child Abuse Prevention Month and Sexual Assault Awareness Month? And I don't care where we start, but I think maybe we should put it in this larger, like, global context to talk about why the work happens in the way that it does. So why the awareness month, and what should we know about them?
Sure. You want to start, Elizabeth?
Sure. I think in terms of Child Abuse Prevention Month, that while most people are aware that child abuse happens and that it's a serious issue, people don't tend to think of it happening in their own community, for one. So that's one part of it, is that we need to be aware and vigilant, even in spaces where we're comfortable. And I also think that we believe that child abuse is preventable. And a lot of people might be kind of taken aback by that. It's a bit of a strange thing to think about sometimes, but we believe that through community support, and through changes that happen on a larger scale, we can really build a community that is aware of the dangers and supportive of each other. Everybody says it takes a village, and truly it does take a village to enact this sort of change. So we just like to raise awareness of the ways that we can prevent abuse, and the supports that we need from the community to make that happen.
Yeah. So Elizabeth, are there like one or two things that you advocate or message, particularly like this month, or that have been messaged this month about child abuse prevention, that you want to make sure that folks are leaning into and tuning into, where there are a couple, typically the month has like a theme?
Yes, yeah. So I guess the messages I would like to pass on is that 91% of child abuse is perpetrated by somebody that the child knows and trusts.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about stranger danger. That's a big thing that we inform our kids of, but real prevention efforts need to include that side of things. That unfortunately, children aren't always safe with people that you know or people that you trust, and we really need to be aware of those type of things, and watch out for red flags where like people wanting to be too close to your children or volunteering their time too much. Those can be red flags that might make you suspicious. And I also always try to encourage parents when I'm talking to them to really inform your children about body safety. Make sure that even at age appropriate levels that you're talking about things like what their body parts are, what they're called, who should touch them and who should not. Because those sort of things can really make a big difference when it comes to a child telling you what's happening, and a child even feeling comfortable enough with you to share something like that, even that they might know is uncomfortable or taboo in certain situations. So it's never too soon to start talking about how to be safe and how to respect others' bodies, as well as make sure that people are respecting yours.
Which is why things like comprehensive sex education are so important, because not every, right, sometimes it's hard to teach what you don't know or are unfamiliar with, or you haven't had access to. And also probably why roles like yours are super important in the recovery and healing process, is to help provide families some education, so and some support, because as they're most vulnerable, if you don't provide a container of support, it just creates opportunities for more vulnerability, and that's part of both the prevention and intervention. So your work is super important. All right, Jan.
Yeah, I mean, some of that, again, there's so much overlap, right? And just, it makes me think of, that last piece. One of the trainings that we offer for community groups, for parents, for teachers, is called the Darkness to Light Stewards of Children's training. And we have 3 staff members who are trained in that program. It's an evidence-based program that's nationally recognized, that really does help people understand what are those red flags, right? What are some of the things that we can be doing to modify the spaces that children are occupying to reduce the likeliness of incidents of sexual violence? So absolutely agree with that perspective of, there are things that we can do to reduce these rates of violence, and having these conversations in age appropriate ways, starting at young ages, is so important. And that, again, is part of what we do too. So yes, those conversations, right? We need to be having these conversations all year, right? Not just in April. But April is this time where we often are able to kind of at least highlight it, right? That, whether it's child abuse or sexual violence, this is something that impacts all of us, right? I think there's that tendency to want to believe this is something that doesn't happen to people that I know. It could never happen to me. And that's understandable, right? That's comforting. And that's a normal, like, psychological protective way of trying to, navigate the world. And when we start talking about statistics, when we start kind of recognizing, no, actually, this is something that impacts everybody, right? Whether someone's a survivor themselves, or if they've supported someone, or maybe they don't know that someone they're close to has experienced sexual violence. It's just important to be able to start having those conversations so that people have a better sense of what to do, right? If they're disclosed to, and also to challenge the isolation that so many survivors face. So often people are concerned, like, no one's going to believe me because I've never heard anyone else talk about this, right? And so helping people see they're not alone, right? That there are supports in place. I think that's so incredibly important. And that can look a lot of different ways, right? It can be more private, where it's like individual conversations. It can be in a group, like we have a support group for adult survivors. It also can be even more public, like we have an event happening tonight at 6 o'clock, Take Back the Night, where, we'll see what happens with the weather, but hopefully we'll be marching around downtown Urbana, starting from the Lincoln Square Mall. But if we get rained out, we'll still be there with art supplies and a space for folks to talk about their experiences if they want to. So really, some of that is that educational opportunity, the opportunity to help people start thinking about, okay, well, what resources would I need if someone disclosed to me? But then also really challenging the narrative that this is something that doesn't happen here, it doesn't impact our community, because that's not true anywhere. But there are things that we can do to create a safer and more supportive community where survivors are not feeling so isolated or concerned that they won't be believed.
So I love that. And so these larger advocacy initiatives and educational campaigns are one, to focus the community's attention about the needs, about the causes, about what's happening, and to increase public dialogue and discourse so that we sort of don't keep these things as secrets. And you both have hinted at something that I think we should talk about. So from my conceptualization and many people's conceptualization, sexual violence and child abuse are symptoms of a community's or family's disease and distress, right? Like they're the result of what happens when people, when there's structural problems or in individual lack of support and resources. So can we talk a little bit about sort of those larger scales? Like if I'm going to see this as a symptom, like child abuse or sexual violence, what are some of the bigger pictures, right? Because if we're going to do prevention, we've got to kind of go upstream and figure out, like, where does it come from? Can we talk a little bit? And then I promise we'll get back and talk about some local work too.
Sure. I'd love to take that one on if that's okay with you, Elizabeth, and
go
join
ahead.
in. So I think, Karen, you're talking about the fact that prevention doesn't just happen at the individual level, right? We look at the socio-ecological model where we're looking at individuals, we're looking at relationships, we're looking at community, and we're looking at society. And to really create change, we have to work on it from all of those different levels, right? And so I talked about our prevention work where we're working with students, where we're talking about what are the things that contribute to high rates of sexual violence, like addressing strict adherence to gender norms and things like that, right? That's super important. But then there are those societal and community pieces too, right? So if people are seeing attitudes that are supportive of people who cause sexual harm, right? That contributes to more incidents, weak policies that are not supportive if people are reaching out for support. If our institutions are not believing people, right, or allowing further harm to happen, those are all things that contribute to these rates of sexual violence. And so, yeah, absolutely thinking about what laws do we need to have in place, right? And not just from like a, punitive perspective of, it's going to result in a conviction, because again, so often that's not what justice looks like, but also what resources are there. And I'm sorry, I did not silence my phone. So, but also thinking about that piece, right? So, for example, in Illinois, we have something called the Sexual Assault Survivors Emergency Treatment Act, or SECETA, that allows for free care in the emergency department after a sexual assault. And that's something that a lot of states do not have. It's so incredibly important. It is actually illegal for the hospital to bill a survivor for any care that they receive. And that's something that took a state law, right? Like, so having those laws in place are really important. But even there are opportunities for improvement. Even under CECITA, it does allow some hospitals not to treat folks who need evidence collection. And so then we see people getting transferred from sometimes an hour or more away to receive care here in Urbana because we do have a treatment hospital, right? So again, there's that opportunity for advocacy to say, okay, nice try, but let's keep working so that we're not asking people to go long distances, because then again, that contributes to people feeling I don't have the support. Why would I reach out if there aren't going to be these opportunities for me to actually be taken care of? And that's just, one example at that more societal level. And then again, thinking about, what is the community response when someone comes forward and talks about their experience? So yes, so many different ways, but I'll leave it there for now, because I think we absolutely have to think about this from every single level.
So Elizabeth, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to say that we need economic and emotional support for parents.
Yeah.
I mentioned that 91% of abuse is perpetrated by someone the child knows. 71% of the time it's a child's parent.
Yeah.
And so when you think about the different stressors that a family might be facing already, and the way that can contribute to abuse, we realize that really, if we can take some of the stress off the parents and give them some more education, some more resources, some places to turn when they need help, that will go a long way in terms of prevention. But I also want to talk about the 20% between 71 and 91, because a lot of the times what we see here is that it's a family who didn't have another child care option, didn't have a quality, safe child care option. So they're turning to a family friend or even someone in their family because they need that child care. And unfortunately, a lot of times perpetrators take advantage of that situation. Yeah. It's the most vulnerable in our society that will be taken advantage of the most. So the child care and supporting and educating parents is a huge piece of what needs to happen in our community too. I think it would really go a long way.
Wow. And right, I was like, there's the quote that says, the way that you can judge a society is by how it treats its most vulnerable, frequently children and women broadly. And if we can think about laws, policies, and procedures that look at vulnerability, even though child abuse and sexual violence can happen across all socioeconomic levels. But we know when families are disconnected and isolated and under pressure, and when communities have like lots of silos and silence is promoted and people don't feel safe and don't trust each other, it just sort of creates this breeding ground for all forms of violence. So if you live in a community family that is healthy, supported, and connected, some of these sort of social ills just sort of go away, because first of all, there's more light on them. And then also it just sort of builds in prevention. Would you also offer or assert that that people sometimes don't see these issues in the way because there's still so much stigma and shame? Can we talk a little bit about, and also how do we go about sort of challenging the stigma and shame? Because again, when a family experiences child abuse, there's so much stigma and pathologizing, right, and blaming or sexual abuse. So can we talk about the stigma and shame piece?
Yeah, I'll speak to it just a little bit to say that a lot of times, even though we talk about grooming children, we don't necessarily talk a lot about how perpetrators groom everyone around the child as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of those grooming behaviors, parents really aren't always recognizing as red flags. And so that kind of puts a pressure, which is the whole goal. It pressures the parent to say, oh no, he couldn't have done that. I've known him for years, or I've trusted him for years. All those different types of subtle victim blaming type of moments really can be detrimental to the children. And we always believe that children start to heal the moment that they're heard and
Yeah.
believed.
Yeah.
Some studies suggest that 98% of the time that a child discloses their abuse, it's true. It can be substantiated. So when it comes to those hard beliefs that we have that so-and-so couldn't have done it, or placing any type of blame on the child, we really need to come from a place of believing and supporting and hearing the child first.
Yeah.
The first priority.
Thank you for pointing that out. And I'm going to say something, this is not the CAC, but I think now in this world, people hear grooming and they think, right, it's been so like turned into something else. And I just want to say, most grooming behavior is very heteronormative. It's happening, in many, many different families. It is not something that is being done to convert or change or transform. It's actually sort of so often a part of just family systems, and often, right, like just happening where men are grooming women or people in their families. And it is not something that is being done as like again, a conversion, or right. I just think that word has been so demonized. So I appreciate what you've articulated, because again, I think families can sometimes so normalize all of that behavior, because when we other it, we say it doesn't happen here because this isn't that situation, this is something else. And I want people to know that that othering actually stops us from being safe, right? And sort of leaning in with some protection. So thank you for definitely pointing that out. Jay, were you going to offer anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many pieces there, right? I mean, even just taking that part where that's a term that is actually describing something that often happens to children who are abused, and it's been used to cause further harm to folks who are vulnerable, right? So the violence that is enacted against LGBTQ plus folks because of misperceptions and myths is something I think that's really important for us to talk about, right? That it creates more opportunities for other forms of harm to happen, and also, as you pointed out, for us to miss the folks who are actually harming, children, but adults too, right? Some of those same tactics are used on folks of all different ages, and that tendency to kind of doubt or question people's experiences so often is what's so silencing, right? I think it also points to the fact that we're often looking at the wrong people when we have these conversations. And again, this goes back to education. I swear I'm not going to just use that as the answer for everything, but it's so important, right? Because, some of that stigma, some of that shame is coming from the idea that the person who was harmed could have done something to stop it from happening, that they're somehow responsible for something that they didn't do anything wrong, right? That someone else chose to be violent towards them. And so, if we're looking at the person who's already been harmed and saying, what did they do? We're going to miss the point completely, right? They didn't do anything to cause that harm. And so we really have to make that shift to say, well, what are the factors that contributed to someone choosing to be harmful in that way in the first place, right? And as I mentioned earlier, there are gendered components of that, but people of all genders enact forms of harm, and people of all genders experience harm, right? And I think, thinking about that vulnerability piece of there are additional barriers for folks who might be part of marginalized groups who, what does it mean if you're disclosing to someone who's part of a small community who maybe is already over policed that they caused you harm, right? There are some unique barriers in those situations too. But in order to really start challenging some of this, we need to shift from what did someone do to be harmed, instead to, well, what caused that person to enact that form of harm in the first place? Because if we don't, we're never going to change anything. And also we're often causing harm, right? Like if we're asking questions of survivors who made it through, right? Whatever they did, they made it through. That's incredible, right? That's something that's deserving of support, belief, making sure they have the resources they need so they can decide what healing looks like for them, again, in their own time. But if we're not making that shift, we're never going to actually change things. And I think it's scary, right? It's scary at an individual level. It's scary at a community level to have to admit, yeah, you know what? Somebody I know, someone I care about, could experience sexual violence. Someone I know, someone I care about could cause sexual violence, right? They could choose to be sexually violent towards another person. And that really shakes people's beliefs, right? They want to believe like that things, that there's some sort of order to the universe. And that's an understandable feeling. But if we get too caught up in some of these myths and kind of societal and cultural ideas about how these things happen, we're at risk of causing further harm to our community and individuals.
And perpetuating it, right?
Yep.
When you were talking, I
Yep.
was thinking about, sort of listening to the news this week, right? And everybody's like, you hear about the shooting incidents that have happened, right? Everybody's trying to keep themselves safe, air quotes.
Yeah.
But I think that we do this with sexual violence too, is that or child abuse, we say, it wouldn't happen in my family, or that if I am well behaved, or I am quote unquote a good parent, or if I dress right, like these are all the gender, if I dress right, or I look right, or if I don't go to this place, or if I don't do that, like that somehow I'm going to create these rules that are going to keep me insulated from a world that I think is dangerous and predatory. And we're living in a society where many of those ideas about who gets harmed and how have been racialized, have been stigmatized, have been demonized. And Elizabeth said, most of what's happening is happening in our homes with people who look like that we know, that are pretty close. But if you look at the media, or if you look around you, your fear is of the other. And so of course it doesn't happen at home. And that only feeds and contributes to the stigma. So, right. And the last thing that I want to say explicitly, you both have said it, but I was like, if I'm a survivor, I know you can't hear this enough. There is nothing you've done to contribute to your abuse. You hear that. I don't care what kind of people told you. I don't care. I came to this community working at, it was at Rape Crisis at the time, but I was like, that was the message that, just to constantly reinforce, it was not your fault. I don't care if you had a drink. I don't care if you were out. I don't care if you left home and didn't tell your parents. I don't care, like none of that. If somebody does something that was offensive or harmful to you mentally, physically, spiritually, they are the people who caused you harm, and it was not your fault. And you need to hear that as many times as we can say that, because I think there's so, friends will say something, and extended family and well-meaning people. I'll never forget my favorite line that my aunt told me after I was sexually, I was raped in college. She was like, sometimes we put ourselves in those positions. And I was like, no, we don't. No, we don't. Right. But it was, part of kind of how we can sort of normalize those messages. So.
And if I can, not to pick apart something you just said that's personal, but I think that it's also interesting when it's framed that way of we, right? Like, because it's suggesting somehow anything that any of us have done that's been harmful, that we're at fault for that, right? Instead of being able to say, oh wait, that wasn't my fault, right? And so just like you said, being able to help not only say that over and over again to survivors in our lives, to survivors in our community, that it is not their fault, period, but also to create that space for people who may have been carrying that feeling for years to start unlearning that, right? Because that is what our society tells all of us, right? That somehow people who have experienced harm are at fault for something that they didn't do, right? That they survived, they made it through. And so creating those spaces to examine how sometimes it's generational, and that plays into that blame and that concern too, where sometimes we have parents who experience sexual violence and they have children who have experienced sexual violence and they feel like it's their fault for not protecting their child. And again, it's not. They
Yeah.
didn't do anything wrong.
And the same thing with physical abuse, right? We can so culturally normalize, like, this is just how we raise our kids. What do you mean it's abusive, right?
Right.
All right. So anything, I want to go back to some local stuff. So we got the ideas, you get that there's a range of services and supports that are available. And I would be remiss if we didn't spend a time to talk about some vulnerabilities in our system. So
Yep.
can we talk about some of the challenges that you might be experiences? I promise we'll end up on a hopeful note,
Yeah.
but I think it's also helpful to talk about some of the challenges both of your organizations and the work is experiences in this moment.
I actually really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it as we're talking about supporting survivors too, because both of our agencies recently have been bringing a lot of attention to the fact that statewide services for people who have experienced sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, and child abuse are looking at facing significant decreases in federal funding.
Wow.
And there's a long, complicated history of how this is happening and why that I could definitely talk about. But for example, sexual violence service providers across the state are looking at a 50% decrease. And for us at RACES, that's our largest funding source is VOCA. This is the Victims of Crime Act. It's a particular fund that's impacted. I know the Children's Advocacy Center is, also a VOCA recipient, and they're facing a 20% decrease. And so our two offices have actually come together to say, we're at risk of having to reduce therapy services because that's what this money funds. And we're not okay with that, right? There's not a lot of attention that's been brought to this statewide. So really fighting on every level, from writing extra grants to talking to elected officials to launching a fundraising campaign. And all of those things are so important. And I think it's easy to get caught up in the oh, we're trying to maintain our staff, but I think it's important to talk about why, right? We're trying to maintain our staff so that we can provide the services that are needed to our community in a timely manner. During the peak of the pandemic, RACES was understaffed and people were waiting an incredibly long time to receive therapy services. And we're just finally getting folks from that waiting list in to see our therapists. And if we don't secure other funds, we're looking at losing at least 2 of them. We have 5. So, that goes back to some of those other levels too, right? Of that investment to make sure that those of us who are working directly with survivors in our community are able to continue to do so. There is a significant risk and a significant vulnerability right now.
Of course, I'm super curious about why, but
I can talk about why if you want me to.
Do we have a second? Can you,
Sure.
is there because I'm sure if people want to know, is it because the numbers have gone down or is
No.
it needs have gone down?
The opposite.
Right. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So people don't know, right? So
and I
why?
don't want to be flippant in saying the opposite, but we knew from early on during the pandemic that incidents of domestic violence were up, right? People were, often isolated with people who were abusive towards them, right? And didn't have resources. More recent research is coming out to show that especially teen girls experienced higher rates of sexual violence during the peak of the pandemic too. So I mean it very seriously when I say our services are needed now more than ever. But in terms of why we're seeing this decrease, this is a legacy of decisions made by the previous federal administration. So this funding, it's a little bit wonky how we get it. So the federal government created a pool of funds that was supposed to go to benefit victims or survivors of violent crimes. The funding is derived from convictions of white collar crimes, which is something that could be unpacked in a whole nother session, right? But during the previous administration, they weren't prosecuting as many of those cases, so there wasn't as much coming in. And then they also diverted some of those funds to the Treasury Department. So the money that was supposed to go for people who've been impacted by violence was actually going to the Treasury. It's impacting us now because the state, so the money goes from the federal government to the state and then to our coalitions and then out to us, right? So there's lots of different layers. At the state level, they were able to maintain funding at the same level for 4 years by using funding that hadn't been spent, right? People were, maybe they were understaffed, so they didn't spend their full amount they were expecting to. And so they kind of backfilled in and as long as they could. That's not possible anymore, right? And so there actually has been legislation at the federal level so that money won't get diverted like that anymore. But you can't make up for years of underinvestment, right? And so that's where we are now. There are other states that had to navigate this 3 or 4 years ago. And a lot of those states just said, fine, we'll take care of it, right? Yes, this is a federal issue, but it's impacting people in our state, right? And so that's kind of where we are right now is we'll see, right? We haven't seen increased investments in, children's advocacy centers or sexual violence services at the state level. I know that our coalition, the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault, is asking for an increase in the state budget to make up for that. And part of that is because the state's contribution has remained pretty much level for an extended period of time, despite inflation, despite the fact that we all really want to make sure that we're providing adequate support for our staff too, right? So that's kind of in a nutshell, what happened. And it is complicated, right? Because this is a federal problem that has been fixed. But again, making legislation that doesn't look at, okay, but that's years, right? That's years of getting decreased investment in that pool of funding. You can't make up for that.
Yeah, there's a hole in the bucket.
Mhm.
Okay, Elizabeth, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, we, like Jay mentioned a little bit, we are facing a big cut in our VOCA funding. It's a 20% cut for us. But again, for us, where that money goes is for counseling. So I talked some about that we offer counseling for children and their non-offending caregivers. And that counseling is such a crucial piece of the healing process. People talk about, they like to throw around hurt people, right? But I always say that healed people heal people, because what we've seen with the CAC studies show that when we're able to connect them to services, children who come through our center, 98% of them never go on to hurt another person. Yeah. So when you talk about those statistics and talk about ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, all of those different things, we've gone through so much as a society already with the pandemic and with justice issues and everything that we're facing these last couple of years, that a family who has this additional crisis and trauma on top of it really needs that immediate and trauma-focused, victim-centered care. So that's what we can offer. We offer crisis counseling that gets families in within a week of when they're seen at our center. But again, that VOCA funding is what pays for the counseling. We have to pay the counselors. So yeah, it's a huge cut for us, but the fund is really promising. We're really excited about this new campaign that we've launched. We've already seen some good community support. And so we're really looking forward to seeing how the community is going to show up and support us in this kind of crisis that we are facing.
Oh, yes. And you hinted at this. It's either, we know pretty well from the data, either we invest in helping intervene, treat, promote cures, and have healing-centered approaches, or people spend a lifetime in agony and it costs us exponentially at the end. So, and in every system, so from education to health, to the criminal justice, to employment, there is no system that is not impacted by not investing in promoting healing on the, for victims. And I think sometimes people right, it seems invisible, right? So, but it all based on the data, and we know this, people will be sicker. They won't be as employable. They will have problems with their own, maybe child rearing and parenting. Right, like you're both interrupting cycles of violence, intergenerational trauma. So again, if we want to save money as a society, the smaller investment here creates a large scale investment in the future. And I think sometimes people only, we're always so tempted to be symptom on the other end, and we want to put out the fire, and you don't see like, oh, the little bit of investment here really made such a significant contribution or difference in people's trajectory. So I hope people will see and hear and support, and if there are states and other advocacy efforts that can happen, that we make sure that we sort of elevate and talk about those initiatives, because it's the least, in terms of it's the least that we can do as a society. And if you're somebody who's sitting at home and who's like, well, I give to this and I give to this and I give to those, remember, early intervention and prevention is worth a pound of cure. So
I would just add, I think all very well put. In terms of who's going to be harmed the most, right? I don't think anyone, any survivor's, support system should have to pay for support. Some people have access to make that pivot if they need to, but not everybody does, right? And I think that, when we talk about who are we as a society, who are we as a community, who are we valuing, right? If we're saying, well, if you can't pay for it yourself, you don't get therapy, I think that's a problem, right? And like I said, I don't think anyone should have to pay for therapy. I think we have a responsibility to our whole community, to people who've been impacted by traumatic experiences, by various forms of harm. And certainly if someone has experienced sexual violence, to then ask them, well, just shop around till you find someone who takes your insurance and you can pay for their copay and they're a good fit for you. That's a lot. That's a lot to ask of someone who might be in a really difficult spot, whether it's because they have had a recent experience that's kind of still impacting how they're thinking through things, or because maybe things are overwhelming because they've been triggered and things are coming back up for them. It's important for there just to be an easy place to say, okay, this is where I need to go. And while our agencies aren't at risk of closing, we are at risk of having to tell people, okay, we're here, but you have to wait. And that's not okay.
Yeah. And so my little soapbox, one, if you want to be culturally responsive and you want to reach individuals who've been historically and culturally and traditionally marginalized, we know that access to care is having capacity when people want it, because it takes so much to overcome those barriers to actually get in the door and make the phone call. And if you don't strike when the iron is hot, many people again suffer or engage in sort of maladaptive behavior as coping to deal with it. So part one. And the second thing, and you both didn't say it because I think you're minimizing it, but your team, your counselors are actually trained in ways, the words that you've used are survivor-centered and trauma-focused. And there are many, many clinicians and therapists in town that are wonderful and great, but there is a lens and filter that survivors who've been impacted by child abuse or sexual violence need, and not many people have that training. Right. And so your centers actually provide a unique therapeutic intervention that doesn't exist broadly. So I can't just go to Psychology Today or call my insurance and be guaranteed that I'm going to get the care. Yeah. And right, if we want to stop re-traumatizing people, we don't have them go to clinicians who aren't trained to provide the healing-centered work that our survivors need.
Yep. I think
so you minimize, but I want to make sure
I'm really
you're not doing what other people do, right?
Yeah, grateful that you brought that up, right? That we have folks with incredibly specialized training and knowledge and passion, right? Like they're choosing to be here because they care and they care about making a difference. The other thing,
and are making less money than other provide
work
a
on
whole
that,
bunch
but
of other
yes,
things.
right? Like, it's true that is something that absolutely is a challenge for our whole field and a big conversation. And, within mental health in general, people are talking about we need to be better compensating people. And I 100% agree. The other thing that is unique to sexual violence service providers specifically, and again, this gets a little bit in the weeds in terms of policy stuff, but we have a level of confidentiality that other mental health providers do not. And so for a lot of our clients who maybe they are going through a criminal case, having that absolute privilege, which basically what that means is even if we get subpoenaed by an attorney, the judge is like, I want to see what you've been talking about, we can say no, right? Unless there is there's a waiver on file, we are able to protect our clients' information, the folks who are calling us on the hotline. We have the ability to say, no, you don't get to see that, right? We're truly confidential. And that's something that is unique to rape crisis centers. It's in our state law. And so when we're talking about people losing access, well, quite frankly, to a therapist they may have already built a relationship with, they also could be losing that absolute protection in terms of their privacy.
So get involved,
Yeah.
make phone calls. I'm aware of the time, and I want to leave this last 5 minutes to say, if there are messages that you would like to get out, maybe to survivors or stakeholders, what are your kind of closing messages that you want to make sure you articulate? But thank you so much for your time.
I want to make sure everybody knows that you don't have to be a mandated reporter to report suspected or confirmed child abuse. The number to call here is 1-800-25-ABUSE. And if you have any doubts, anything, call the hotline. Just call the hotline and get the child the help that they need. And I would also say that if you are curious more about what a forensic interview looks like, or what we do here to be child friendly and trauma focused as much as possible, you can come check out our center. We're having an open house a week from today. It's from 3 to 5 p.m. And I'm sure we can share more information about that, but you can also follow us on Facebook. All the information's on there too. And like I said, it's an open house a week from today, April 27th, 3 to 5. So we hope to see some good supporters there and show you guys around and kind of demystify some of the stuff like we talked about. So,
and the CAC is in the public health building. So right. And so it's easy to get to, it's very accessible, and we'll make sure we have more information available.
Is it okay if I put the QR code?
Yes,
in?
yes, yes,
Okay.
yes, yes. Go
So
ahead.
I'm going to do a shameless plug for both of our organizations. Like I said, we've come together because we recognize that if services are reduced for one of our agencies, it impacts all of us. So we are doing a joint fundraising campaign to try to make sure we're able to maintain our current therapy service levels. And so there's a QR code that links directly to the donation page that I'm going to leave up for a little bit. But I think it's especially important, not just because it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month, not just because it's Child Abuse and Abuse Prevention Month, but because we're talking about funding cuts for survivors in our community to know there are still people who care and care enough to keep fighting really hard to make sure that services are not cut. So I kind of mentioned in passing that we've been taking a multifaceted approach. Probably our community are going to get sick of hearing from me because I've been talking to folks at the local level, the state level, the federal level to say this is not okay. And so I want survivors in our community to know that there's still a community of support. Our resources are still here, and we are fighting to make sure that they stay available at the current levels.
Thank you so much. So we will make sure that there's information available. Thank you both for like all that you continue to do and that your organizations do. There's, if you're listening to this live and today, there's Take Back Tonight, the night, which is a international effort. It's the first step to sort of reclaim the night for survivors. And then next week, there is the open house at the Children's Advocacy Center. So we really hope you will get to know the community, get to know these important organizations, and ask for help if you need it. So stay well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.